quality of life for people of African descent. This forum aims to ensure their full political, economic, and social inclusion in their societies without discrimination of any kind, which means equal enjoyment of all human rights. The conclusion of our panel today will be incorporated into the work of the forum. I am now honored to introduce our esteemed speakers. I will introduce them all, and then I will call the first speaker to share a presentation on their work in this area. In California, we have Dr. Thema Bryant. Dr. Bryant is the 2023 president of the American Psychological Association. She is a tenured professor of psychology in the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University, where she directs the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory. She is one of the foundational scholars on the trauma of racism. She is a regular in national media, recently quoted in, to give just a few examples, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, CNBC, and NPR. Like me, Dr. Bryant is a past APA representative to the United Nations. In New York, Her Excellency Matu Joini is the ambassador and permanent representative of South Africa to the United Nations in New York, the first woman to serve in this role. She has previously served in many private sectors and governmental positions, including as Deputy Director General of South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation and head of South Africa's Diplomatic Academy and Policy Research and Development Unit. Ambassador Joini is a globally recognized champion, not only of people of African descent, but also of women, currently serving as a chair for the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Soon to be joining us from Cape Town, South Africa, we have Dr. Nasiswa Titi, the founder of Siyaza Z, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, House of Decolonizing Knowledge. She is a pioneering scholar and practitioner of the decolonization and children's rights of South Africa. Her work is aimed at law, reform, and child rights advocacy through youth participatory mechanisms and community engagement, grounded in decolonial feminism and interdisciplinary approaches. Dr. Titi holds leadership roles in the South African National Child Rights Coalition and has served as the vice chairperson of the Psychological Society of South Africa's Division of Research and Methodology. And last but certainly not least, in Washington, D.C., we have Rebecca Jones-Gaston, Commissioner of the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She has oversight for major federal programs that support social service promoting the growth and development of children, youth, and their families, protective services and shelter for youth and children in at-risk situations, and the adoption for children with special needs. Before joining President Biden's administration, Commissioner Gatson was the Child Welfare Director of the state of Oregon, where she launched a major transformation built on trauma-informed, family and community-centered, and also culturally responsive programs and services. She has worked in the field of human services and child welfare for nearly 25 years as a social worker, an advocate, a therapist, and consultant, and also an administrator. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for today's co-sponsors and the permanent mission of South Africa to the United Nations, the United States Department of State, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. To our viewers, please use the Q&A box to ask questions. Later, our speakers will answer as many questions as we can get to. Ambassador, I'm going to go ahead and bring you up as our first speaker to share with us some of the work that you have done in this area. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akbar. Thank you for that introduction. Distinguished delegates, distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen from wherever you are in the world, thank you for being with us here this afternoon. And at the outset, I wish to thank Dr. Taima Bryant, the president of the American Psychological Association, and fellow co-sponsors for the opportunity to collaborate on such a pertinent issue during the second session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And yes, Dr. Akbar, my focus will be on the work that South Africa does on this issue here at the UN. And I will touch on what guides our work, what guides our interventions. The title of our side event today, Leaving No One Behind, Advancing the Health and Well-Being of People of African Descent, is both timely and topical as we engage upon it during the International Decade on People of African Descent. The principle of leaving no one behind is closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And for South Africa, we have endeavored to continuously amplify this meaning across the United Nations. During the high-level political forum here at the UN in 2022, we co-hosted two side events, one titled The Impact of COVID-19 on Women and Girls' Mental Health. And the second side event that we co-hosted was titled The Challenges of Data Disaggregation to Eliminate Systemic Racism and Related Discriminations in the Implementation of the SDGs and the Recovery from the COVID-19 Pandemic. And that particular side event we co-hosted with the AEPA. The lessons learned from these interactions, and dare I say, the proverbial golden thread is that the intersectionality which exists and the impact of racism and discrimination, particularly on Black people and people of African descent, and especially within the context of global health. The special rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, confirms this in her 2022 report on racism and the right to health, wherein she utilizes the frameworks of intersectionality, anti-coloniality, and anti-racism to examine the global health impact on racialized people of the living legacy of past and ongoing forms of racism, apartheid, slavery, coloniality, and oppressive structures. And we've heard this morning in the General Assembly during the opening segment, there were very clear examples of this and the devastating impact of this intersectionality. Allow me to highlight where the report further clarifies the legal frameworks that applies to various population groups affected by racism. And I quote, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the DDPA, includes specific measures to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And it requests states to ensure the right to health and healthcare to people of African descent, indigenous women and girls, migrants, people belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, foreigners, and migrant workers. Both the declaration and the program of action also contain guidance for states on the type of data to collect, which should be disaggregated and take into account economic and social indicators, including health and health status, infant and maternal mortality, life expectancy, and mental and physical health care, so that it can elaborate targeted social and economic development policies with a view to closing existing gaps in the social and economic conditions. And in the program of action, states are urged to establish national programs to promote the access by victims or potential victims of racial discrimination to basic social services, including basic health care, and to eliminate disparities. So the DDPA is a framework that continues to guide us today in doing the work. And as at the UN, focusing on normative framework, this is one of those normative framework, together with others that are quite important in addressing this issue. I'd like to highlight the following 3 points. Firstly, some background on the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. It was adopted at the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. And it acknowledged that slavery and slave trade were appalling tragedies in the history of humanities because of the extent of the barbarism and also their magnitude, organized nature, and their negation of the essence of the victims. It also acknowledged that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, and that they are among the major source and manifestation of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Africans and people of African descent were victims of these acts and continue to be victims of their consequences. Some of their unfortunate consequences borne by people of African descent adversely affect their health, including mental health. And to this end, the DDPA contains guidance for states on specifically collecting disaggregated data with various categories to expressly close the existing gaps in social and economic conditions. Furthermore, the DDPA, the Declaration and the Program of Action, urges states to establish national programs to promote access of victims or potential victims of racial discrimination to basic services, including basic health care, and to eliminate disparities. These are tangible recommendations which truly emphasize the actionable part of the Program of Action of the Durban Declaration. And it is for this reason that South Africa continues, both in Geneva and here in New York at the UN, to reiterate the inextricability of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action to the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. The second point, the report of the Special Rapporteur put a spotlight on the particular plight of the imprisonment of Black women and how the shackling practice is a direct legacy of the subjugation and confinement of Black women during slavery, as well as in the racist post-Civil War carceral systems that have influenced modern prison policies. This certainly correlates with the bodily and generational trauma carried by Black women today and emphasizes the intersectionalities of discrimination, which I mentioned earlier. It is not lost on me that the message is particularly driven home by the example that the Special Rapporteur uses, and I quote again. As Winnie Madikizela Mandela recalled on the many ways in which imprisonment under the apartheid regime had affected her, she said, "The years of imprisonment hardened me. I no longer have the emotion to fear. There is no longer anything I can fear. There is nothing the government has not done to me. There isn't any pain I have not known." It says it all, the undeniable lasting impact of imprisonment on the mental health of Black women. It is our duty as society to assist those who have faced such traumas to overcome them. Thirdly, and the last point, I wish to encourage us truly to be active in advancing the well-being of people of African descent. The Special Rapporteur in her recommendations asserts that we all have a role to play, from the businesses to industries, governments, healthcare, and practitioners in civil society. We are all capable of achieving positive and lasting change if we do so together. We express our appreciation once again to the co-sponsors for their cooperation and for playing a critical role in advancing the well-being of the people of African descent in the multilateral system and educating us how to achieve the sustainable development goals by leaving no one behind. South Africa maintains that the international community must work towards achieving the sustainable development goals in an integrated, cooperative, and responsible manner. This side event is focused on how this can be achieved within the context of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And as South Africa, we will continue to play our role in the different structures of the UN to make sure that we advance the interest and we fight for justice for the people of African descent. I thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for those words. Powerful in terms of what the declaration has found, but also the recommendations and the continued legacy of racism that lives in the traumatic experiences of people of African descent, and you highlighting specifically Black women. I want to turn over this conversation to Dr. Bryant, who is focused on the impact of racism in the mental health of people, the implications of racial trauma, and have her open a discussion from that perspective. Dr. Bryant, are you able to come on?
Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to turn on my camera.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. I know the audience is being very graceful with all of us. We continue to experience trauma just from the virtual world. So.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Akbar. Thank you, Ambassador, and all of our esteemed guests. I am so excited to join on behalf of the American Psychological Association in this conversation as we think about racial stress and trauma, but also wanting to start with the realities of the richness of our heritage and identity. In the words of Sweet Honey in the Rock, we are the ones we've been waiting for. People of African descent have incredible stories, rich stories of history, of heritage, of resilience, of survival, but also thriving and flourishing. We have been able to engage not only as a result of who we are, but also what we have had to come up against. And so we recognize that racism affects us not only financially and socially, politically, educationally, but also in terms of our mental health. And so I want to invite those who are gathered on today to, in their own time and in their own space, to take collective breath. Often we are stressed and holding a lot within our bodies, minds, hearts, and spirits. And so we inhale in through the nose and exhale out through the mouth. I invite us to recognize and celebrate the heritage and the contributions of those who came before us, not only for people who are gathered here as persons of African descent, but also those who are here to support, to consider across the continent and across the diaspora, the richness emotionally, spiritually, economically of the contributions of those who hold our stories in their DNA. The reality is that racism can be a form of trauma. It can overwhelm the nervous system. It can create distress within us. It can create depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress symptoms. Many of us hold the tension in our bodies. We call it somatic complaints, when we really embody the stress in ways that can manifest as migraines, as nausea, as backache, as body ache. And so recognize the ways in which racism has affected you physically, emotionally, and perhaps even spiritually. But we know the story does not end with the impact of racism, that we have both coping strategies and resistance strategies. And so as we think about coping strategies, those are ways in which we heal, ways in which we soothe and nourish ourselves, knowing that we are worthy of care. And not only do we have soothing strategies, but we also have resistance strategies, the ways in which we combat racism in all of its forms. And recognizing that many of us have multiple marginalized identities, we also want to consider the impact of gendered racism, of racism as it shows up, as it is integrated with religious intolerance, with sexism, with classism, with ableism. And so from the standpoint of the wisdom of African women, I would say, who will sing an upbeat African girl song? Because the downbeat says she's so black and lazy and slack. But who will sing an upbeat African girl song? We will sing it for ourselves. We will sing it for ourselves. We will put our souls in our throats and our hearts and our lungs and sing of our survival. And the world will marvel at how long we hold our notes. And so we hold our notes and heal ourselves and our communities. How is it that we heal? We first recognize that culture is medicine, that we heal ourselves by remembering or by learning for the first time the truth of who we are, recognizing the greats who came before us, those named and unnamed, known and unknown, those who survived the realities of enslavement, those who survived colonialism and neo-colonialism, those who survived the theft of land, the theft of labor, the theft of our artistry and our culture. And so we heal by remembering and recognizing our culture. We also recognize it is healing medicine to tell the truth about the things that we have survived. And when we think about what we have survived, we consider intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. So it is not only about our own stories, but the stories of our parents and our grandparents, our ancestors who lived and dealt with experiences that were supposed to wipe them out, and yet we are still here. Those of us who are survivors of the transatlantic slave trade think about the point of no return, and yet we have returned. And so we are mindful about our possibility when we consider the truth. We also recognize that we heal racism through our resistance, through our activism and our advocacy. And we are so glad to be a part of those efforts at the American Psychological Association, where we have not only apologized for the role of the field of psychology in systemic oppression and racism in particular, but also we have been creating an action plan for us to be a part of the solution. And so across the globe, for us to be intentional in our advocacy work and in our policy work to create holistic spaces where we can grow and where we can thrive. We also recognize that we heal through our self-care and community care. And so I am mindful of the importance of African people being able to rest, for us to be able to have joy, for us to be able to embrace love, for us to be able to have access to healthy foods and a safe place to live. And so we care for and nourish ourselves, and we also care for and nourish each other in our community care, and recognizing that social support helps us to survive and to thrive. We also recognize the healing medicine of our artistry, what we create in our poetry, in our music, in our dance. We speak life. As we collectively think about the need for people of African descent to be nourished and for us to be able to embrace our seat at the table with agency, knowing that we have voice and empowerment, it is also important for us to recognize the need for allies and accomplices, those who will join us in this effort, recognizing that our health matters, our lives matter, our future matters. And so I want to invite those who have gathered in this space at this time to take sacred pause, to remember not only what we have survived, what we are healing from in the present, but then for us to also take sacred pause to reimagine our future, from the standpoint of liberation, of what does it look like when African people are able to flourish and shine unhindered, uninterrupted, uncensored. This is the life and the reality that we are seeking to paint. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant, for those inspirational words, but also words of truth, words that penetrate us, that anchor us in this conversation. I love the part where you said, what does liberation look like for people of African descent? You know, and I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nesua Titi, to talk a little bit about her work related to child rights and to how her, focus on colonizing and liberation has anchored this conversation. Dr. Titi, please take over in this conversation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this evening session in South Africa, and to the all the organizers as well for inviting my voice. If you've never heard me speak before, I stutter. So if you're using any aids, just be aware that I stutter, and the way in which the transcripts are writing might be affected. I am situated in South Africa and speak from an African-centered psychology perspective based on Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity is a lens that does not belong to, but is mainly attributed to Katie as a Sasante. Afrocentricity for grounds and understanding African phenomena and people from an African-centered perspective, with the agenda of wanting for African people what they want for themselves, and seeing them in how they see themselves. Such a lens is based on recognizing history, geography, time, culture, the social aspects of life, and the environments in which people live from the perspectives and experiences of Africans. Today, I will not be focusing on children. I will be focusing on colonization and the trauma on all African people. This topic is very personal. Therefore, I am using the subjective tense because I am an African descendant and cannot attach what my land and for bearers have experienced. African people should not be required to take an outsider position when addressing colonial and the issues that face African people. When we do that, we distance ourselves and silence ourselves and alienate by choice. Let us take an insider-outsider perspective, because it is a powerful tool for raising the health and well-being of African people. The questions of the colonization and Roma, the land has not forgotten the violence it was subjected to, and needs healing from the Roma. It has experienced. We know that the land has not forgotten, because of the coloniality. The mindset of colonization is very much with us, in and around us. This requires a decolonization of the minds of African people first. When we acquire new ways of thinking of when we acquire new ways of thinking and of seeing how we begin to colonize ourselves. Though the colonization and apartheid have hindered that the land on which we live, and we are still suffering the consequences of the killings of lives, the theft of what we had, and the very land itself, and the destruction of who we are, as well as the sense of belonging. So there is a cultural that we have, where we are neither a full African at times and able to be and experience the relations and the cultures of who we are, because of so the land in itself then is still feeling those actions it has experienced, and something must be done to heal our land. So this trauma that I am speaking about is based on the ways in which the colonization what was achieved. The backdrop of it all, what was racialized, as I said, and it was and it was based on hierarchical epistemologies. it requires of us to change how we view ourselves and how we position as well. So because we are part of the land, we are in fact the land. Without us, there is no land. So the state of non-being that was rendered to us is something that we must learn. I mean, it's something that we have to unlearn and to begin to conceive how ourselves as full human beings, and not see how ourselves based on the outlooks of those that thought of us as inhumane and unhuman. So the concept of the land is very important. If we are the land, and if people of African descent are part of the land, wherever they are carrying the land with them. We need to see Africa as a breathing, speaking, feeling, and existing that requires a leadership that is formed by and such a perspective requires an in-depth knowledge and understanding of the political, economic, social, and cultural consequences of colonial Roma that is still experienced by people of African descent, no matter where they had been dispossessed to. And this understanding must be used to address the inequality, inequities, and the collusions that African people are still experiencing in a relation to the other forms of collusions that we are already experiencing. So if we understand that the leaders in the lands in which African people exist, wherever they are, then we need the governance and public administration in all its department that is using a trauma-informed strategy through an African citizen-centered lens. Might we then consider what strategies and what platforms and spaces are required for us to convene the leadership of the lands in which African people exist to facilitate interventions that would enable African people to heal and to thrive. Now, self-understanding is important. So when we are talking about colonization and the effects and the impact thereof, I wonder if we must not adjust the way in which we refer to it. When we are speaking about the past, saying past experiences, it may sound like we are saying we wanna rehash what has already passed, when what we are actually wanting to do is to understand history, because history enables us to think according to a timeline. It enables us to mark what has happened in the current state of affairs. Finally, for us to find the healing we need, to find the solutions we need the allyship. We need the support, meaning that the history must also be taught to the descendants of those who once colonized us. And we must also be aware to the modern day forms of that may and detain us today. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nesiswa Titi. Appreciate the incredible and profound knowledge that you provided to us. I just have to quote some of the things that you said, which I know impacted me. And before we move over to Commissioner Gatson, who will talk about the impact of children here in the United States, you said African people exist wherever they are. Right. And that's something that I think will be so important for us to center in this conversation. We're having a global conversation about this, and we have partners all over the globe, but it is so important. You also said colonization is in and around us. Wow. We don't think about it in that way, because the impact of colonization has been embedded in the very systems by which we operate on a daily basis. So we don't consider the impact of colonization. But the way that you put it really anchors and centers the idea that we do need to consider it. You said history must be taught. And when it comes to our children and them understanding the importance of history, the impact of history, and some of the things that are happening across the nation related to the censoring of history, it's important to understand its impact if we do not share the history that has impacted us. And the last thing that you said is we are still suffering the impact of colonization, the land that we love, because sometimes we feel like we do not belong. And that is so true. So Commissioner Gatson, I would love for you to take this opportunity to talk about your work. I know that your focus has been at looking at children who are at risk, but globally, children have been the focus of your work and professional life. And, what are your thoughts around this topic?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And as Dr. Akbar mentioned, my background has predominantly been working with children here in the US, particularly connected to the child welfare system. And the one thing that I can say very confidently is that the child welfare system, as it stands, was absolutely built to do exactly what it's doing. And we've learned so much about what the impacts are of separating children from their families, and that there is some intentionality around what families are being impacted by our system. One thing that I'll start with, though, is really just wanting to highlight within the administration for children and families, there is a focus on mental health and behavioral health for caregivers, for families, and for young people, and really taking some action and trying to make sure that as we're thinking about the resources that are needed in communities, that we're also taking a look at what do those resources need to look like, who's carrying out those resources or providing for communities, and being able to really openly talk about the impacts of race and racism and colonialism is such an important part of this work. So child welfare itself was really created in this framework of rescuing and separating children from their families, or making decisions around deserving and undeserving families, be it because of poverty, be it because of race, be it because of geographic location. And that has had decades of impacts on communities of African descent, of other communities of color here in the US. And what we know from the research is that the risk or the amount of abuse or maltreatment that may happen doesn't increase by the community that you belong to. And so what we do know is that here in the US, the child welfare system has a disproportionate impact on African communities of African descent. And I want to share a little bit of the data about how stark the difference is. Child welfare receives calls to a hotline or concerns raised by the community around concern for the safety of a child. So a screened-in referral, an African-American child is nearly twice as likely to be screened in for concerns around abuse than their white counterpart. The number of children that are coming into the foster care system are over 1.5 times the rate of their counterparts. And when you're in the system, if you're of African descent, you're likely to receive just over 50% of services that you need as a young person who may have experienced abuse or have been separated from their family. This is critical in that, again, the prevalence of abuse isn't higher, but the impact of a system that was created to rescue children is having a disproportionate impact on this community. And we can't de-link the history of child welfare from the experience of colonization and from slavery in this country. And the ability to have a different impact is going to require that we actually take action. And so oftentimes when I talk about these issues, and no disrespect to the researchers and the evaluators here, I think it's so, so important, but it's also, what do we need to do in our behavior that is different, that will actually change the impact of the system on communities? And so I think thinking about what are the systemic pieces that we have to dismantle, to change, stop doing, so that the outcome is the intended outcome, or the outcome is what we want for the communities that we're serving, and in this case, people of African descent. Again, the system was built to do exactly what it's doing. And so unless we're going to take action and do something different, we've studied it, we know it, we're aware of it. What are we going to do differently? Some of the things that we're trying to do within the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families is to actually set a table and hold time with those that are actually served by the system as it stands, and have those families actually participate in thinking about what is something different that we need to do in serving children and families. And that isn't always easy to do. We, as a system, aren't necessarily very good at listening to the communities that we're serving. And I think we're also not good at acknowledging the toll that the system built in the way that it is, that is carrying out harm, actually, onto children and families. Those of us that actually represent the communities that are most harmed by child and family separation and child welfare, as part of the system, are also those doing the harm. And there's something really intentional that needs to happen to be able to not just think about change in the system, but also the impact of your own well-being as a caretaker, as an advocate, as someone who's working towards serving children and families and meeting the needs of the community, particularly when it's the community that you belong to. And that is so very important. The impacts of racism, of colonialism, are carried out in our system, but they're also carried out by a diverse group of people, including those impacted by this system. And so as we think about mental health and well-being, we have to be thinking about what is the mechanism that gives access to these systems, services, supports, and are they reflective of the actual communities that we're serving? That includes, are the practitioners representative of the diverse communities we serve? Are the methodologies and the philosophies and the values that are brought forward in the services for children and families, in my instance, but for the communities that we're serving, are they actually grounded in the values and beliefs of the community being served? And I think that's where we've got some opportunity as an international community, as a global community, to learn from each other and really grow the array and the scope of view and of creation of models and ways of engaging and meeting communities' needs that, frankly, oftentimes seem very siloed or separated by country boundaries, or even in the U.S. state boundaries in regards to the ability to access these services. And so, I will wrap up my remarks because I want to get to some of the questions and dialogue with this amazing panel that we have here today. But I think that the challenge that I put forth for all of us is finding the action and really figuring out how we are actually changing the systemic structures for which our work and the access to the services and supports needed in our communities, how we actually build those. And maybe it's rebuilding, reshaping as we're dismantling, and really being able to acknowledge the impacts that racism, colonialism have had on our communities, on the workforce that are conducting it, on the lens that is brought forward oftentimes in research and development, and not forgetting to actually have those that are impacted and experiencing the world that we're wanting to affect, having them at the table in co-creation and feedback, and be able to honestly let us know whether or not we're headed in the right direction, and if what we're doing is actually having the change that we're wanting to see happen for those that we live among, our own families, and those that we serve. And so I think action, perseverance, resiliency are all the characteristics that we've got a long history of across our diaspora, and lots of opportunities to really, again, think about what are the systems, what are the mechanisms, what are the modalities that actually are needed for healing and building towards well-being for people of African descent around the world. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts today.
Commissioner, thank you for your wisdom, for those words, for your knowledge, your insight. I want to just share a few things that you said that were really impactful to me before I move into the Q&A part of this conversation. And I invite all of our panelists to turn on their cameras as we try to make this as as much of an interaction as we can in this virtual world. But you said, how are we changing the systems and the structures? And that's a great question. I think a question that we continue to contend with as we are thinking about ways to, as you said, rebuild and reshape. At APA, one of the things that we talk a lot about is that we cannot dismantle systemic racism in the absence of advancing racial equity. We must do them both simultaneously, because otherwise, what will we rebuild in place of what we're dismantling? So I thank you for those words of knowledge, but also encouragement in the way that we're going to be able to forge a path forward. We continue to sort of work on a racial equity plan that will systemically work on the way that we will tackle this, not only in psychology, but hopefully in greater society. I want to highlight one more thing that you mentioned, which I think is extremely important, is that sometimes those that represent the child welfare system here in the United States may have come historically from the same people that created the harm, right? And so what do we do when there are, practitioners or caseworkers or people that are in charge of caring for our children when they are at risk or when they are in harmful situations and in abusive situations, and at the same time, they don't have the competency to understand the historical implications and underpinnings of racism, of racial trauma, of oppression, of discrimination, and et cetera. So it really is up to us to make sure that we are knowledgeable around all of these things. I want to address a question that really focuses on this, not only related to children, but adults, families, communities. And I want to see if Ambassador, you're able, Joini, if you're able to address this question. How can we most effectively, from your perspective, the reading of the declaration, the recommendations that were made, address intergenerational racial trauma, particularly within the context of deprivation? Do you have any thoughts on that for our audience? Okay. Or any of the panelists, feel free to address that question. How can we effectively address intergenerational racial trauma?
Hi, Maisa. I'll try and answer that. So intergenerational racial trauma, you asked, or just the trauma? Are you referring to just the racial trauma or all forms of trauma?
Well, interracial racial trauma, so specifically racial trauma, how can we address that effectively, knowing what we know, what the research that's developing around this area, the understanding of the impacts of colonization, understanding that liberation is a key aspect, to addressing racial trauma. Do you have any thoughts on that, especially in communities that are significantly deprived, where sometimes basic needs are not even being met, let alone our capacity to think about how our trauma impacts our daily well-being?
I think the point of the departure on that might be if we begin to ask ourselves how that trauma shows up. What are the ways in which racial exclusion happens? So is it in terms of the education system? Is in terms of access to services? Is it our languages, perhaps? Is it the resources that our children don't have access to, but other children do have? So I think it is about asking ourselves how African children or Black children are excluded, and then work on ways to include our children.
Thank you, Dr. Titi. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on that? How can we effectively address generational racial trauma? And do you have any thoughts in terms of any recommendations that you can give to our audience?
Apologies, Dr. Akbar. Somebody was in my office, so
that's fine.
Yeah. How do we address intergenerational racial trauma? The first thing that comes to my mind is, what do we do in different spaces? What do we do at school, in the school system? What do we do in our communities? How do we heal, firstly, ourselves, and then make sure that we do not pass on to the young people, but we instill in them a particular sense of identity of who they are, where they come from, and really pride in who they are. And there are various ways that can be done, but I think the education system is very good at that. But also government policies and government programs. I'm thinking in the context of South Africa, where in this case it's and you can substitute interracial for apartheid. So those of us who went through the apartheid system and what it did to us, how do we then make sure that it's not passed on to the next generation? Like, what can the government do? There are certain programs that the government can do. Having national days, for instance, having days that are heritage, having days that focuses on our liberation, having days and those will be national days, if you like, a series of national days that addresses that. And I think similar strategies can be done at a government level, at a schooling level, community level. Culture plays an important role in it, what we do culturally, our music, and so forth. So there has to be a well thought through strategy of how to address it, a comprehensive one that touches on different aspects.
Thank you for that response. If you can stay on, I have a follow-up question to that, but I want to be able to also lift a few things that Dr. Bryant said on an individual level in terms of how we sort of, deal with that type of intergenerational racial trauma. And she talked a lot about coping strategies. How can we as individuals implement coping strategies? Now, that doesn't deal with the societal and systemic issues that you address, but I do want to lift those real quick and then follow up with some thoughts. She said, culture is medicine. We have to learn the truth, right? Whatever culture has been established is going to be the type of medicine that we take in. And I think that is so important as you're sort of thinking about globally. How do we start to put in and shift the culture, not as a culture of deprivation and a culture of scarcity, but a culture that identifies abundance through our racial identity and that we're socialized in that way. The other way that she talked about is through resistance, activism, and advocacy, right? How can we teach our children and communities that they can anchor themselves in a way that they are advocates for truth and healing and liberation? She talked about the importance of not doing this by sacrificing our self-care. I think when we look at the monumental history makers in our global society, many of them that were in the forefront of these changes, these fights in our nation and globally, didn't take their self-care into consideration and often deteriorated along the movement process. So how do we rest and take the opportunity to rest? How do we find joy? How do we anchor in love? And most of all, how do we make sure that we're taking care of our basic needs along the way? And last, but certainly not least, is how do we galvanize our allies and our accomplices? Because we know that this is not the responsibility solely of people from African descent. We know that we need the participation, the active participation, and the commitment of our allies and accomplices to understand what colonialism has done to our country, and that has not just harmed us, it has also harmed them along the way. So with that said, how can we think about civil society, commissioner, ambassador, in your roles, civil society, how can we look at government and the support of government to advance the health and well-being of people of African descent? Certainly, we can pull a call to action to each person individually, but we can't do that in the absence of a joint effort from our governmental systems to say, we believe in this too, and we must move this forward. Any last thoughts for our audience around those things?
I'm thinking of the instruments that we have, the instruments that are in place that we can leverage to build on what we started. But the issues that you are raising, the issues of galvanizing allies, of culture, and there are various instruments within the UN that allows for that. But let me just on galvanizing our allies. Solidarity, the whole issue of solidarity, and it can be solidarity amongst those who are in a similar situation, knowing that we are in this together and we can learn from each other what has happened in one settings that can be applied. And we often call that South-South cooperation in the UN space. So within South-South cooperation, what are those what can we learn from each other, and what are those mechanisms, what are those instruments that can assist us? So that's one. But I refer a lot to the special rapporteur. When I was talking, I referred to the special rapporteur, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who is grappling with those issues that you are mentioning, and really going deeper, because we can be very technical, but she is going deeper, looking at the, and I don't want to call them the softer issues, but they're really so important and so key that unless we address this at a deeper level, at a personal level, you are not able to build a solid base for that. And Some of it have to do with healing, taking care of ourselves, the issues that you're talking about in terms of taking care of ourselves. And I can tell you that often activists from our civil society, activists that I know, that I grew up in South Africa, the last thing that you think about when you are driving a particular cause is taking care of it. It's you just go for that. But how do we really meaningfully make sure that we pause and strategize together on those? But I'm thinking of these, how does government really create an environment, provide the frameworks and support the whole of society. And I mean the whole of society, which will include our civil society, the institutions that we build to make sure that we do this work and we do it meaningfully. Now, it is through instruments that are done here at the UN that we sign up to as different governments. But how do you make sure that they're implemented on the ground? I think that's where the challenge is, and that's what we need to grapple with. Implementation of these instruments. There's a very interesting instrument that we have here. It's called the culture of peace. Every year, the UN celebrates the culture of peace. Right. And if you think about that resolution on the culture of peace, it touches on all these things at a personal level, societal level, community level, but really implementation in different member states and within those countries is something that we need to grapple with.
Thank you. Thanks. Ambassador Joyini. Wow. How do we create a culture of healing? Commissioner, any last words on this? What role can we take here, especially if we're talking about stateside related to creating a culture of healing for our children, our families, our communities?
Yeah, I don't know if I can say it any better than the ambassador did, but in many ways, it's like we've got to kind of get past the need to shame and blame on both those that are experiencing the deprivation, the racism, and those sort of things, and those that may be part of the culture community that is in the majority or is the inflictor of really getting to the actual healing and being able to if we're thinking about government, it's where are we investing, and it's a quote that I have on my board behind me, and I can't remember who to attribute it to. So it's not mine, but it's one that I use all the time, is that the most dangerous phrase in the language is "we've always done it this way." And I think it is, being able to acknowledge what has been and kind of where we are. And then it's really the visioning for forward, and not being so tied to a structure, a process, a framework that has existed for a while that we know isn't yielding what we need. And then the last thing that I would say, and it's a saying that I heard just last week with a group of colleagues where we were doing we're trying to model a little bit for those that are coming behind us, and it is around well-being and intentionally creating space and time to actually take care of yourself. And the notion is that wellness is resistance. And really embracing that, and that in order to continue to be in a resistance mode, that you've actually got to be well and take care of yourself and honor yourself as well.
Mental health is a civil right, Commissioner? We all have the right to have healthy selves that show up in that way. Dr. T, I'm going to give you 2 seconds that we are. I'm sorry, Ambassador, did you have a few more?
No, I just wanted to share something with you that brought in South. It's just been launched in South Africa now, and it's called Masiviwe Social Movement. And this is a good example of government coming together with a professional body of psychologists, together with civil society organizations it's called Masiviwe, Let's Be Heard. And it's a movement that brings all the stakeholders to create a social movement to improve mental health. and access to services and break the stigma. But it also focuses on HIV and TB services as well as caring for healthcare workers, their mental health. So there's an example of how government, a professional body like APA, and civil society have come together as a social movement.
You keep saying that the international community must come together. We can't tackle this individually. We have to tackle it all together. Dr. Titi, I'm going to give you 1 minute to close, and then I'll close this up. I know our participants are over time, but I just wanted to give you that 1 minute to just close your piece of the conversation.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think it is really important that we look at the traumas affecting African people as a collective traumas. That it is not traumas affecting only the people, but traumas that are affecting our land, and that the solutions attached to those traumas need to be handled from a governance perspective that is informed by the various disciplines. And I think that psychology is at the center because the leadership of the countries, particularly African countries, might also be suffering the effects of traumas themselves. So it is a governance perspectives it is from the governance level, using trauma-informed perspectives, which are African-centered, to deal with issues of the land and of people of the land and who are also elsewhere. Thank you.
Dr. Titi, thank you for those fine words. I love it when you say it is not just about individual trauma, it's a collective trauma that sits ancestrally in the land. And Ambassador, you said something that Winnie Mandela said, the years of imprisonment hardened me. There isn't any pain that I have not endured, right? And we have to understand that it's an international community agenda that we must work on together. Those words are incredibly impactful. Dr. Titi, your emphasis on collective trauma is important. Your call to action to governance and government to say that this is a priority is essential for us to move this forward. And most importantly, anchoring this conversation on psychological science. After all, we are the experts in human behavior. If there's anyone more critically and well-positioned to dismantle systemic racism and to advance racial equity is those that understand the human element and those that understand the psychological science behind it. Thank you to my panelists, esteemed panelists. I appreciate and lift this conversation and look forward to many more of these conversations together as an international community. Thank you to our audience and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Recording stopped.
We are off. Great. We're off. Great. Thanks, Papa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate you. You were so great and graceful. Thank you.
Absolutely. No worries. Take care.
Thank you, Penelope. Goodbye.
Thank you, Penelope.
Thank you, Dr. Maisa, and thank you so much to the team. Really appreciate it. And thank you for dealing with us. And I very
That's okay.
Running down the hall.
Thank you. I'm heading back to the UN now.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.